So have you ever been working on JavaScript code and you change the value of something and you're sure that you had just made a copy of some sort of original data, original object, or array, and you make a change to the copy, and all of a sudden the original is different, that somehow something changed. You look up blog posts on like how to prevent that from happening, and someone says use object.assign, and so you do, and it still happens, right? And like all of this stuff, yeah, I hate that. I hate that when it still happens. So today I'm going to talk about a little bit about sort of why it's happening, but really more around how to think about this stuff so you don't have it happen to you. I have my code editor up here, and first let's look at sort of some happy path values. So let's say that you set up a bunch of variables, and variables look something like this, right? You have a counter, and that counter is, you set it to 2 and it's 2, right? The people array, you set up a people array and it has one value in it, which is the value that you put in. These are all, pretty normal things. It shouldn't be all that crazy of what these things are set to. And honestly, if I then change the people array, if I put a new value on there, I should see the value, right? So if I say people array, again, now I'm going to have 2 values in there. I'm going to have John, I'm going to have Marty. And all this stuff is pretty normal. The crazy part comes in when I want to make a copy of one of these. So I want a new copy of the languages object. And I'm going to say that this is supported languages. I don't want this necessarily to be the exact same as languages. So I make a copy of it. And then that means that I can go and I can change it. And I can add a new language. I'll add German. So I add German to this. And so if I take a look at supported languages, then obviously this is going to have the original languages that I copied, English, French, Chinese, but now it also has German. The problem is the original languages, it also has German. It has German. I didn't put German in languages, I put it in supported languages. Why did it do this? And I think this is an issue that everyone runs into at some point in time. As a developer that's been doing this for a long time, I still run into it every now and then because I think something is going to properly copy something that I pass it and it doesn't. And why does it do that? How do we solve this problem? Well, there's a couple of different ways to solve the problem, and they kind of solve the problem in different ways, and they're not always what we're looking for. In this instance, obviously setting from one thing to another doesn't work, right? Like, why doesn't that work? If I do something like, I have my counter variable that we set up above, right? It's set to 2. If I get a new variable, let's call it a new counter, and I say that equals counter, then my new counter is also equal to 2. And if I say new counter plus plus, my new counter is now 3, right? I added 1 to it. I did a plus plus. That added 1 to it. And what's counter equal? Well, counter still equals 2. This didn't have the problem that we just saw with the object that we were setting in languages. Why is that? Well, you could think of, to a great extent, there are 2 types of variables in JavaScript. You could at least think of them that way. One of them is numbers, booleans, strings. These things you can pass from one variable to another, and it will make a copy. So you can think of it as, if I have a number in counter, if I put that into a new counter, it is making a copy of that number. It is not using the exact same thing, right? I'm not changing. If I change one, I don't change them both. And like I said, that's true for numbers, booleans, strings in JavaScript. So you could think of these, sort of the mental model that you're building on how that stuff works. That is That's exactly how you would expect it to work. The issue comes in when we start looking at things like objects and arrays. Functions don't really fall into this, but the idea of copying does not work when we get into objects and arrays. Objects and arrays are different. If you have a variable that holds an object, that is in some way different than a variable that holds a number or a variable that holds a string. So how do we think about objects and arrays then? When we have a variable that has an object or an array in it, and I want to copy that data, put it into something else, how do we think of that? Well, when thinking about object and array variables, I want you to think about your cell phone. Your phone has an address book in it, right? And you go into the contact list, and it's got a bunch of names in there, and you hit one of those names, and then that person pops out of your phone, right? They were in your phone the entire time. No, that's not how that works. If it did work that way, there's a lot of consent issues that we're going to have to discuss and figure out. But you could think of that name is actually does not have a person in there. It has an address in there, right? It has a phone number. And if I call that phone number, then I can talk to the person. Objects and arrays sort of work in that same way. It basically, what is being stored in that object variable, you could think of it as the phone numbers being stored in there, not the person. So what happens when I have, so if I have an object, let's say I have this object, good book, right? It's an object that has an author, has a first name and a last name for the author, and then it has a title. If I say, okay, I want to make a new scary book, right? And I want it generally to look like what's in good book. So let me copy what's in good book into scary book, and then I can start changing values. So we'll say in scary book, let's change the title, let's change the author. So instead of Brene Brown, we're going to have The Shining with Stephen King. Now, what is in scary book? Well, we have author of Stephen King, the title is The Shining. And what's in good book? The exact same thing. Why? Because they actually hold the same object. Or the way that you could think about it is, when you set up this variable for good book, I need to put something in this variable. And the way I want you to think about this is, the thing to go in with this, the thing in the variables can only hold one thing. It can only hold one value. If it's a number, yes, the variable can hold that. Is it a Boolean, true or false? Yes, a variable can hold that. It's one thing. Is it a string? Yes, it's just one thing. The variable can hold that. But an object has many pieces of data to it. There's an author. It has a first name and a last name. There's multiple strings, right? A variable can't hold that. And so what JavaScript does, you could think of it this way. This isn't exactly how it works, but what we're trying to look at today is what's the mental model? How do we think about this? You could think of this variable as not holding the object. It holds an address in order to get to the object. Okay, so it's like in your contact list, you have names. When you call that number, who do you get? We have this object gets created in the computer's memory, and then the address gets put into good book. So when I say that scary book equals good book, what I'm really saying is the address to an object is going to be copied into scary book, so that scary book and good book are pointing to the exact same object in memory. So if I change one, I change the other, right? So they actually, whenever you could think of this dot right here, this dot is known as a dereference operator. You are basically turning the address into the thing when you go to the dot. And so if I say scary book dot title, the dot goes to the object and then goes to the title of that object. And if I say good book dot, that goes to the same object. And if I say title, it's going to go to the exact same place in memory. Okay? So what we have here are two object variables that are pointing to the same object in memory. That's what's causing this issue. And so this is in fact not a copy of the object, it's a copy of the address to it. Arrays work exactly the same way. So when you create a new array, it has multiple values in it. Well, a variable can't hold multiple values, so it has to take that array and put it in memory, and then the variable actually holds an address to that array. So if I set that variable to another one, it's going to point to the exact same array in memory. So that's what's actually happening here. And if you think of these things that way, it's going to help you problem solve within JavaScript to try and figure this stuff out. So any variable that holds a number, a Boolean, or a string, if you say this variable equals that variable, then you can think of it as it's getting its own copy of it. And so they're not going to overwrite each other. However, if that variable holds an object or an array, you're going to have to do something different if you actually want a copy of that. And so what is that? What is that doing something different? Well, let's look at a couple of things. So first, I'll start with objects. If you want to copy an object from one variable to another, you want an actual different object in those two variables, you can use something within JavaScript called object.assign. Object.assign it's not really built to make a copy. It was sort of designed for something else, but realistically, this is what it's used for most of the time in JavaScript. So what that looks like is instead of scary book equaling good book, we can say that object.assign, and the first parameter we give here is an empty object. And this is our new object that we're creating. And then we're saying, hey, everything that's in good book, make a copy of that and put it into scary book. Okay, now this works in some instances and not others. And we're going to see that. Actually, we can sort of see that right now. So what this does is it makes a first level copy of the object. What does that mean? First level copy of the object means that it takes the author and the title, makes a copy of those, and puts them into the new book. So Scary Book gets a copy of the author and the title, and then if we come in here and we start messing around and changing those values, we can see that Scary Book, in fact, has Stephen King and The Shining. But Good Book now also has Stephen King and the title Daring Greatly. Brene Brown is now gone. And this is now a very different book. What happened? Why didn't this work? Well, we could think of this. The title here is fine. It actually did get its own version, right? I changed it in the new copy. And in the old copy, it stayed the same. Title was fine. And that's because it's a first level variable within this object. The problem is author is not. And the reason it is not is because author held an object, or more importantly, author held an address to an object. And so when I copied author using this technique, it did not copy. It decided to point to the same object in memory. So scarybook.author, I have my own variable for author. The problem was the address got copied, and when I say dot on that one, now I go to the object that they were both pointing to. So this is actually not good enough for our example here. Where is this good enough? Where can we use object assign? Well, that's going to be in, let's say we have a sort of a single level object. That could look something like this. We have a person, it has a name, it has an occupation. And we can see that In fact, we have just a simple object. All of the properties within that object are first level. They point to a value, right? A string in this case. We can add another one here, age. And they're all first level properties, right? So here, if I wanted to copy it, first of all, equal sign won't work because it's going to point to the same object in person, right? So what I can do is I can say let new person equal object.assign empty object first. This is saying like, okay, I want a brand new object. Don't copy the one I've got, right? The way this works is it's going to put whatever is in the second argument into the first one. So we have a fresh new object to begin with, new in memory, and then the one that we want to copy. And so if I say new person dot name is Marie, and new person, let's change the age. And here we can see that new person now is Marie, occupation developer, age 35. What is person? Person is still Anna, still age 42, right? Because we did object assign, and that's what saved this. If I wouldn't have done object assign, if I would have put person in here, it would have messed everything up. But instead, I do object assign. That gets me a new object in memory. I get a new memory address location, and then it copies all of the values in. So that does exactly what we were hoping for it to do. The previous example, however, if we have anything in here that's nested, it's not going to work. So what's the rule of thumb here? The rule of thumb is if you have an object that does not have an object or an array inside of it, you can use object assign, and that will make a copy for you. Okay? So it has to be a single level thing. It cannot have an object or an array for any of the values in here. If it does, you cannot use object assign to actually get a full copy. All right, so what does this mean for arrays? What if I have an array that I want to make a copy of? Well, let's say I have an array here of books. So I have some books. I want to, let me show again the bad way of how this happens. Let's have some happy books is going to equal books. So what does this do? This copies the address of this array. And so now happy books and books are pointing to the same exact array. Okay, they actually hold the same exact thing. So if I say happy books and I change A Tale of Two Cities to, the Cat in the Hat. So what happens now to books? Well, books changes because they're pointing to the same exact array in memory. So how do we prevent this? For arrays, and again, this will only get you a copy of first level elements. If an array holds another array or an object, this doesn't work. But if you just have like an array of strings or an array of numbers, this works fine. Okay, it works perfectly, which honestly is probably going to be most of the time. So how do we do this? Well, we take a slice. So if I do a slice and I don't pass any arguments to it, it makes a copy of the array. It makes a first level copy of the array. So it copies the string Alchemist, it copies the string A Tale of Two Cities, and you'll see here books does not change. I can add something to happy books. So I can add a new book there. Again, books still doesn't change. And happy books is going to have all the things in it that I just put in. Okay, so that works for first level. Now, what happens if I have an object in my array? Well, if I have an object in my array, and I try and change that object. Oops. So this is going to be 0, 1, 2. This is the second element. Dot title equals, I think it's debatable whether this is a happy book or not, but we'll go with it. And so I change it to Goodnight Moon. What happens? Well, in books, it changed. The title changed. So the title changed to Goodnight Moon from Fight Club, and same is true in Happy Books. Why? Because these are the same object. Okay, so again, rule of thumb, if your array does not contain another array or an object, you can use the slice method to make a copy of it. If it does contain an array or an object, that doesn't work. So what does work? Let's say, honestly, I think 9 times out of 10, this is going to be fine. You're going to have an object that is fairly simple. And you're going to be able to just, do object.assign. You're going to be able to copy it. Or you're going to have an array that just has a bunch of numbers in it. And you're going to be able to do .slice, and you're going to be able to copy it. It's not going to be an issue. However, if you do run into that issue, I can tell you right now, there is no way within just the JavaScript language to solve it. JavaScript does not have a method or anything in order to handle this problem. You can't do what is called a deep copy in order to get this to fix. So whenever you see something, if some people are talking about arrays or talking about objects and they talk about deep copying, that means that you have an actual method that goes through all the objects and all the arrays and makes copies of all of the values so that nothing from the original is being pointed to by the copy at all. It's a deep copy of that structure. And JavaScript can do that, but there are actually plenty of libraries that are out there that you can use to do this with. And one that I see used a lot that I'm going to look at here is one called Lodash. So I can import, there's a Lodash method called a clone deep. So this is something that you could import into your code. Let's go ahead and take a look at this one again. So let's take a look at this good book. So I have this good book. I want a full copy of this. And, the way we tried this before was with this little block of code. And if we take a look at that and I look at good book again, so the original good book got changed, right? Because this sort of object assign also did not copy the author. It copied the address to the author. And so they both have the same author, and there's nothing you can do about it. Well, instead of using object assign, we could use this Lodash method instead. So if I call clone deep here, we can see that, hey, the original object did not get touched at all. And that means that this scary book was a full copy all the way through. There were no addresses kept here. If there was an object, a new object was made and all the values were copied over into it. And so changing the copy did not even touch the original. This is the answer to this. This also works with arrays. So you could use that same clone deep on an array and you will get a full brand new array. If there were objects or other arrays in there, then they will get their own copy, and you will not have anything that is pointing to the same thing from the original at all. So this is kind of the answer to this. I think that you probably don't want to use clone deep right away. If you only use it if you have to. If you have an array that has an array or an object in it, you use clone deep. If you have an object that has an array or an object in it, you use clone deep. But otherwise, you could use these other methods, and this is really all you need to kind of solve this problem. So if you've ever run into this before, try and keep this in mind. And also try and keep it in mind in general. Like start thinking about objects and arrays a little differently than you think about numbers and booleans and things like that. They really work off of sort of references more than they do exact values. Now, the underlying JavaScript engine might not treat it that way. It might actually be programmed a little differently, but this is all about thinking about things in certain ways so that you can solve problems with it. So try that out and see if you run into any issues with that.